to draw in the handout that I gave, and then we're going to make our way through the first 10 chapters. It's going to be more of a pretty a bigger picture of how we're going to work through Leviticus, but I tried to put Leviticus in the context of the Torah and then to emphasize how Leviticus 16, and in particular verses 15 through 20, as maybe the center of the center of the center of the way that the first 5 books of the Old Testament are structured. And so we were using a word called a chiastic structure. And so we see that Genesis, this is just how we would visually represent what is given to us in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But we, with an odd number, we're going to have a center, and that lends itself to what in Hebrew writing is called a chiastic structure. So we're moving toward a center point, and this is what I was seeking to explain. Now, there's not only just a way to see that with Genesis we have the beginning and the entrance of God's plan to dwell with man that is ruined by sin, and then how he will recover it in the covenant promises to Abraham, how that then is developed with Abraham's descendants, and then how Exodus then develops that through indeed. Whoops. Good.
Keep going.
All right. But we are also able to see that there's parallels in the way that Exodus and Numbers function. Exodus, you remember that at the beginning of Exodus, there is a new Pharaoh, and that Pharaoh no longer remembers favorably Joseph, so that now Abraham's descendants, just as God promised in Genesis 15, are made slaves. But then God raises up a deliverer, hearing the cries of Israel and remembering the covenant that he made with Abraham, and provides Moses. Moses then leads Israel out of Egypt, i.e. the Exodus, and we come to find out that God first, before they enter covenant, he delivers them and redeems them. The deliverance is bringing them out and then taking them through the Red Sea, destroying their enemies. The redemption is it's in the night of the Passover, that the blood of the Passover lamb indeed shielded all of the households of Israel, that the blood was on the doorpost. Therefore, God says that he purchased or redeemed Israel as his own, thus indicating what came to be established in the Mosaic Law, that every firstborn within Israel, whether it's a son or a daughter or an animal, had to be bought back or redeemed back from Yahweh. He harkens that back to the event of the Passover. But anyway, you can see that there's movement, right? That there was the Exodus out of, and at the end of Exodus, we have the tabernacle is constructed. God fills the tabernacle. And then we'll pause, because geographically there is a pause. There's no geographical movement in Leviticus. Everything, in one sense, is centering upon one place, that is the tabernacle, and what God is revealing in the activities that are centered in the tabernacle. But in Numbers, we have movement again. And in the same way, Exodus brought Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness. So in Numbers, we have Israel wandering through the wilderness and eventually arriving at Deuteronomy on the very threshold of the Jordan and the land of Canaan. And so there's a parallel function of Exodus and Numbers as we think about the way in which the first 5 books of the Old Testament are even geographically moving us through the foundational narratives of the Old Testament. In addition to geography, genealogy is in one sense a twin pillar. So if you're going to think about some of the main ways that the book of Exodus, the book of Moses or the Torah, also called the Pentateuch, imagine this is like, you could say Jacob's ladder, you could say it's a railroad, all right? But you've got these two rails right here, all right? You have geography and genealogy. And the book of Moses develops through geography and genealogy how God is going to bring his people back into the place where he will dwell with them. The geography we have seen has been emphasized. I'll show you, we'll draw another picture that sort of gives us a pattern that we see repeated over and over again. But we started in the beginning where there was creation, formless and void, that eventually comes to create everything, and then a garden is made. And then there is exile from the garden. Then we see that God is, in that sense, he starts over with Noah, and then from the flood, they start at Mount Ararat, and then there is, in one sense, a new creation, a new race, and then we see again that there is a rebellion against that with the Tower of Babel. Judgment again comes. We then see God chooses one man out of Abram, then gives them a new name, promises him a place, leads them to that place, and we see everything operating around what we come to understand to be the land of Canaan. All right, that then develops that, again, from Canaan, they go to exile in Egypt, and then they're brought back, again, being led all around the very land of Canaan, but first through the wilderness. All right, geography is going to be a key way the book of Moses is developing how God is going to bring his people back into that place and dwell among them. Genealogy is the other one, and we have seen that genealogy is the key way, especially in Genesis, but not restricted to Genesis, that there's an ordering to things. And we've seen that indeed, in one sense, the hope of Genesis 3:15 seemed to hinge upon the firstborn Cain. But obviously, Cain rising up and slaying his brother Abel cancels out the line of Cain. And the murder of Abel cancels out the line of Abel. But then we see God provides to Eve, the mother of the living, Seth. In that sense, we see that again, there's a waiting for God to provide a line for him to fulfill his promises. We get again to when we go forward and we get to Noah, we have his 3 sons that were saved, and we see that only 2 of them is blessed and one is cursed for the sin that he committed against his father. We go and we see that Abraham has promised that from his descendants are going to be a great nation that will bring a blessing, but his descendants are not through man's wisdom, namely his wife's, through Hagar, but rather it's going to be through Sarah's seed that God himself must provide, and so it is Isaac. Genealogy is functioning, and in Leviticus, we're going to see that genealogy and geography, they merged in the central activity of the tabernacle. But what we're going to see, and we'll go back to Exodus 40 for the tension, is from here we've been traveling at the end of Exodus, we are able to see God has provided the place that is the tabernacle. God has filled the tabernacle with the presence of his glory, but yet Moses cannot enter. What we will see is that here, in that sense, in the geographical center of God's dwelling place on earth among his people, which is the tabernacle, that is the genealogy. It is going to be through the Levitical priesthood. The tabernacle is the geography. The Levitical priesthood will be the genealogy. so that it's not Moses, but it will be the descendants of Aaron. Though that is the line within the Levitical tribe that is going to provide what the tabernacle gives to Israel. The first 10 chapters are going to unfold for us three aspects of God's provision, not through Moses, but rather through the sacrifices he prescribes, the priesthood he prescribes, and then the ordinances is what I'll call them. But it's all the restrictions that are required for the sacrifices being made. There we will see the resolution of the problem in Exodus 40 that Moses is not able to enter. And it is going to be through this provision that we're going to see this is what the tabernacle is going to provide. Now, last week we saw that if you took the center structure of the Torah, and then you divided it into Leviticus, so that there was yet another chiastic organization, which there is. Do you remember the central chapter, the hinge point of the book of Leviticus? 16. Right? 16. And really we could even go further and say verses 15 through 20 provide the most center point, which Old Testament scholars say is the very center point or hinge upon which the whole book of Moses or the whole Torah hinges upon. And there we see the Day of Atonement and the offering of the sacrifices that covers the sins of the people and the priest, so that God can dwell among Israel and Israel can fellowship with God. Therefore, we learn that the message of the Torah is the same message of the New Testament. That forgiveness of sin through the provided sacrifice that God has, offered by that appointed priest, is how God is able to dwell with his people, and his people are able to have fellowship or union with him through his presence. Now, we're going to talk big picture first, and then we'll get into some of the others. Therefore, when we're learning from the book of Leviticus, which is in one sense also teaching us about the Torah, sin is what separates mankind from God. The holiness of God cannot dwell among sin and sinful people. The only way that sinful people can have fellowship with God and God can dwell with sinners is that atonement must be made. The message of the gospel is the message of atonement. If we are not communicating to people the atoning work of God's Son, Jesus Christ, we are not communicating any biblical message. We are always offering to people what God offers, and that is atonement is the way you can be united to God through Jesus Christ, him dying for your sin. This is not a New Testament message. This is the Old Testament's message. It is the New Testament's message. We see here the order given very clearly to us. So I think for me at least, understanding the Old Testament by looking at how the bigger pieces work together has been difficult for me. And I have really appreciated how biblical scholars have helped to teach how the bigger picture fits together. Because when I read the Old Testament, I have lots and lots of questions about the pieces and the parts. And so this is where we were. Today, what I want us to be able to see is, and Peter, I will take you up on your spray, that there is going to be a repeat pattern that we've seen, and it will become a part of Leviticus. Here you go. Because what Leviticus presents to us as we read it in the order of the Hebrew Bible, that is the Torah, is that we have seen God repeatedly bring his people from a place, meet with them on a mountain, and then we'll see a sort of counterfeit spiral come off of that particular meeting. And so I tried to do it on a computer, and it just takes me so long to try to use computers to draw. And so I'm just going to do this as a way. All right. So there's different ways, and I have taken this from another gentleman's work. Morales is his name. The name of the book is Who Shall Dwell in the Presence of the Lord, or Who Shall Ascend the Mighty Mountain. I'll get the title back in a little bit. But there's a pattern where God is taking his people from a particular kind of disordered place, and then he meets with them. But then there's going to be sort of like a revolting counterfeit that follows. And then we see this repeated over and over. First, in creation, we would have sort of the darkness and the void of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. That God creates out of the darkness and the void. And all of the numbers will correspond. He creates Eden. And there you remember when the rivers were described to us, they are running down, i.e. the elevation of Eden is a mountain or a hill. And the counterfeit comes with Cain. In each of the places, we also see that there will be a person. We go further and we are able to see the floodwaters. And then you remember the place. Mount Ararat is where the ark lands. And Noah and his family that come off. And what is the first thing that they do after they are released by God from the ark on Mount Ararat?
Build an altar.
That's right. They worship by way of sacrifice Yahweh, the God who indeed delivered them, for they found favor with him. But right after that, what happens? What is sort of the counterfeit city that soon follows? The Tower of Babel. All right. Then we come to the next one, and we're able to see from this place called Ur. You can see that geography and genealogy is constantly working here. Mount Moriah or Horeb, and here we're able to see Abraham. And the counterfeit would be Ai. When we keep moving, and this is what we're able to see is repeated. And from here we have Egypt. Right. And here we have Moses and Sinai. The counterfeit comes with them when you consider Aaron and his calf. Idolatry then will be the centerpiece for how this continues. But even in Leviticus, we find that there is a similarity. And that what is happening is we now see what God is doing in this new place, which is the tabernacle, is that there is, in one sense, in the midst of the people of Israel, there is a holy hill upon which God dwells, and they will meet with him, and he will dwell among them. That's the wilderness. This will then, we will see in Numbers, the counterfeit will also be seen not only in Numbers in their disobedience, but also we will see in Leviticus. It will be who approaches him in a, we'll say, in a profane state, right? Or we just could say there is a wrong approach to God's presence. Now, in each one of these, we are able to see that this pattern is teaching us over and over, but not in just to not repetition with variety is the key to learning, but in a way that is developing fulfillment of God's covenant promise. And in Leviticus 1 through 10, we will see that this is still going to be what is a tension that is provided in the tabernacle and the priesthood and the sacrifices that are offered according to the ordinances. So we're going to deal with things that most Christians think do not relate to them, and that is completely wrong. So even before we get into the first 10 chapters of Leviticus, I would ask you, Christian, do you have a priest? Do you have a sacrifice that atones for your sin that was offered up in the very presence of God? Is there a dwelling place where that sacrifice was made on your account by the appointed priest? And the Christian would answer, not with exactly the same answers, but with the same categories as the Israelite. Yes, I have a priest. Yes, I have a sin atoning sacrifice. Yes, he offered it in the appointed place that God determined. So while we indeed do not relate to God through what is going to be unfolded for us in the first 10 chapters of Leviticus, the problem that we had before God provided our faith in Jesus Christ indeed was the problem that we see presented to us at the very outset of Leviticus, at the end of Exodus. How is God going to dwell among Israel, and how is Israel going to have God dwell in their midst? All of which is asked because of Israel's sin and God's holiness. So turn to Exodus chapter 40. This will lead us into why the very beginning is linked in Leviticus 1. Verse 32, we see that the tabernacle is completed, and from it Moses and Aaron and his sons washed their hands and their feet, and when they entered the tent of meeting, and when they approached the altar, they washed, just as Yahweh had commanded. He erected the corridor all around the tabernacle and the altar, and he put up the screen for the gateway of the court. Thus Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had dwelt on it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. Now, throughout all their journey, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the sons of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day when it was taken up. For throughout all their journeys, the cloud of Yahweh was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night in the sight of all of the house of Israel. Now, we're reaching back and bringing forward a lot, but what we saw in Exodus is the construction of the tabernacle was, in one sense, the completion, or at least a development and partial fulfillment of what was the promise that Yahweh made to Israel in the covenant at Sinai. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And as God's people, he delineated they are going to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests, and he would dwell among them. Well, in the construction of the tabernacle, we see that this now has application. God now dwells in the midst of Israel. And all of that God achieved through Moses. And yet, when we come to the end of Exodus, it should be a little bit surprising that Moses is not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud dwelt upon it and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. So the question at the end of Exodus is, okay, God has filled it. God now dwells among Israel as he promised. And he has done this through the leadership of his servant Moses. But how is Israel going to have access to God's presence? And this harkens back to what indeed was lost in the garden. God walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening. The presence of God they were banished from. And there you might remember the parallel factors. How did God, in one sense, make it ensured Adam will not dwell in the presence of God in Eden again? That gate which was by the east, who did he flank that gate with? The cherubim. And what are we told? What is the reason that he had to flank the entrance back to the garden? Why did he have to flank it with the cherubim?
Would not enter.
Because something was there. The tree of life. Right? When we saw the construction of the tabernacle, what actually is flanking, what flanks the entrance to the Holy of Holies, and where there is this developed, ornate candle that lights the inner place, which is in the shape of a tree. You remember what flanks them? Those cherubim. So, in one sense, through the way Moses writes Exodus, we understand that the tabernacle, we could say, is like Eden. God's presence is there. The very symbol of the tree of life is there. It is guarded by the cherubim, which indeed is God's presence. They are with God, so they are marked out that place there. And Moses cannot enter it, which means we still need something. Something still has to be provided. The tabernacle and God filling it is not sufficient. Leviticus 1, chapter 1, sort of presents to us, well, this is how we're going to find out. Then Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, and now this is how it happens. Yahweh from the tabernacle, which is here called the tent of meeting, is going to explain how it is going to be provided. And he is able to unfold what is going to be provided by Yahweh so that Israel will be able to have God's presence dwell among them, and Israel will continue to have fellowship or union with Yahweh. And here we can answer it as we've already have, that the first 7 chapters will explain the sacrifices. Chapter 8 will talk about the consecrated priest, and chapters 9 and 10 will give us the prescription of the ordered worship. And it's only in chapter 10 that we will see now Moses will be able to enter. What is also going to be unique is it's going to be through the sacrifices made through Aaron that we will see God will now speak for the first time, not to Moses and then to Aaron, but directly to Aaron. This enables us to understand that the tabernacle and everything associated with the tabernacle is how God is going to provide this dual tension. How can God, who is holy, dwell in the midst of Israel, who is sinful? And how can Israel, who is sinful, how can they keep fellowship with God, who is holy, who dwells in their midst? The tabernacle is the answer. The tabernacle solves the problem, and it solves it through the sacrificial system offered by the Levitical priesthood, which is all consecrated to God. So we'll make some progress on it. I think thinking through the 2 ways that Moses writes about the tabernacle in Leviticus is teaching 2 things. And again, I'm taking this from Mr. Morales or Dr. Morales, right? The tabernacle is either called tabernacle or it is called the tent of meeting. The accent of tabernacle is on God's dwelling place. God dwells with man. When the tabernacle was filled and God came and filled it with his presence, God now dwelt among his covenant people. The fulfillment, in that sense, of the covenant promises as they develop through Sinai, they have the blessing of God's presence, which in one sense we need to make sure that we see. We're going to say some things about Sinai and the Mosaic covenant as we go through Leviticus that are going to help us to understand the future hope for Israel is not the Mosaic covenant. However, we cannot divide the Mosaic covenant from God's covenant promises of redemption to be fulfilled. So here we are able to see what was lost in the garden through Adam's sin and what continues to mark mankind in his rebellion is they have lost God's presence. God does not dwell with man. And what God recovers in his covenant promises, which we say it's what redemption brings, is the presence of God among his people. The presence of God among his people. Now, for evangelical Christians in our country who are primarily sort of psychologized in the way that they think about redemption's benefits, we tend to think about, I just don't want to feel guilty. I no longer want to be ashamed. I want my marriage to be better. I want my parenting to be better. I want my relationship with my children to be restored. All of those things indeed are valid, or at least most of them, some of them. That is not the way redemption offers the grand blessing that God is bringing in fulfillment of his covenant promises. The grand blessing of redemption is God's presence. God's presence. One of the reasons that there should be, in one sense, like a growing disconnect between our fellow American citizens who are continuing down a whole other religious route and biblical religion is we do not offer to people a blessing that is something greater than God's presence. So that when we offer the gospel to them, they are not thinking, what I need is to be reconciled to God so that God may dwell among me and I may have fellowship with God. That's not the way in which they operate. That's not the plane that they inhabit when they think about religion. That is the religion of Yahweh. For you to be reconciled to God means that God would be able to dwell among you and you would be able to have fellowship with him. The tabernacle is how he achieved this for Israel. So tabernacle is accenting God dwells with his people. Tent of meeting, Chris, I'll come back to you. Tent of meeting is accenting fellowship. In one sense, you could say it's like sort of, like hiking a mountain. The ascent of the mountain is, how is it that you might commune or have fellowship at the apex of that hike, right? We will then see the consequence of that fellowship with God and God's dwelling place, we'll see on the backside of Leviticus, demands how they live. That is holiness to the Lord. But both of these, the dwelling, God to dwell with his people and his people to have fellowship with God, are achieved in the tabernacle. So even the two names that are used in Leviticus, tabernacle or tent of meeting, in the same place are accenting, in one sense, the two sides of what is achieved in the tabernacle through the sacrifices, the priests, the priesthood, and the ordinances. Chris.
So at the point that Christ died, the curtain was torn in two. Are we to think about that holy place access in the light of what you're presenting here in the Torah? Is it? Do we see that as God coming out to be with his people, or people having access to the most holy place, or neither of those?
I think the accent is the first, but we're not meaning that God now is equally present in the way that he was specially present in the Holy of Holies. It is to say that God does not dwell. We know that has been destroyed. But even before its destruction in 70 AD, God no longer dwelled with his redeemed people on the earth in the Holy of Holies in Second Temple Judaism. When Christ died and the veil was ripped from top to bottom, God's dwelling place has a new tent. And we then go on to see, where is that tent?
The Holy Spirit puts it in us.
Yeah.
We are the tent.
Which is one of the reasons that I do think, like, if we don't understand the development of God's dwelling place among his people from the Old Testament, we're not going to understand the significance of this, the teaching of the New Testament about the Spirit of God indwelling Christians and the church. So often, and I do think that there's a reason that, with a bad understanding of the Old Testament or an ignorance of the Old Testament teaching about God's dwelling place, combined with a real desire for experiences that are individualistic, I do think charismatic theology is especially easy to fall into, because we have nothing to kind of keep us back from that particular mistake. But when we understand the significance of God's dwelling place as it's being developed in the Old Testament promises and acts of God, then I think charismatic answers really fall short of the expectation and what the New Testament teaches about the indwelling of the Spirit in every believer and the church. Eric.
Before you erased that, you were putting the false city on the right side, correct?
Yeah, in one sense, this is a cycle, and
Right.
and these are sort of we see this cycle running through. So if I really were to be a good teacher, I'd create a handout, and you would have all five of these superimposed onto this pattern, Eric.
Well, I guess like after the flood, it makes sense that Babel would be like the next False Eden type thing. But why is AI?
Because we're going to see that there's
For Abraham during his time from Earth.
yeah,
Why AI?
well, one, it was from a chart, and I didn't go back and read it, so I'll need to double check. But this is not where God met, and we'll come to see the significance of Genesis 22 and the sacrifice there, and we'll see that there the sacrifice that God provides in Isaac's place, the same verbs are used for the sacrifices that are described in 3 chapters of Leviticus. And so this is the place where God had Abraham worship God through the sacrifice, and not there. But I need to go back and read.
What does it say under AI?
This is number 4.
No, I mean directly under AI right there.
It says Aaron.
Okay.
But that's for number 4 when he had the calf in Israel's idolatry. Right. And we're going to see that this pattern, like if this pattern were to be solved, that means that if this were to cease, we're going to see that completion, God has actually brought about completion of his redemptive promises. And thus, spoiler alert, Leviticus is going to end not with this being solved. The pattern will continue even as we come to the curses that will outnumber the blessings in Leviticus. And the last curse is exile, which your Old Testament, that is what happened to Israel. So this is developing for us and giving to us the solution for how it is that God can indeed dwell among Israel, and Israel can have fellowship with God, though they are sinful. Tabernacle is the solution. Tabernacle is how God achieves that. Well, let's get into quickly through the first 10 chapters. What is given to us first in chapter 1 is Yahweh now is directly telling Moses the solution for how there is going to be his dwelling amidst his people, though his people are sinful, and his people, though sinful, are going to be able to have fellowship with God. And he explains the burnt offerings. Now, we're not going to go through every one, but you will see that 1, God is the one who initiates and prescribes the offerings and how they are offered. So what is helpful and often lost on many evangelical Protestants is we do not initiate with God how we will worship him. God initiates with us and tells us how we approach him and give to him what he demands. So we see this clearly and explicitly in the prescriptions related to the burnt offerings. And here, out of all the offerings, you are able to see, though they are different, that they are all given according to God's prescription, and they are all pleasing to God. So the metaphor for what indeed is achieved by the offering of these burnt offerings in verse 17 is they are a soothing aroma to Yahweh. Now, a very key play on words which is used, we would not get it in English, but you can see it in Hebrew, is if we are to travel through the book of Moses, we see when Israel is taken into Egypt, they are slaves of Pharaoh. And so the house of Pharaoh is they are servants of Pharaoh. Exodus then releases or sets free Israel so that now they may be servants of Yahweh. The word for house and servant sounds very similar, and worship in the Old Testament is rightly understood as service. This is even true in Greek, so that like if you memorized Romans 12, 1 and 2, in the King James or the New King James. And I think there's 2 people in the class today who know the King James. All right. I started out as a Christian with the New King James. And so Romans 12:2 renders it, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but when you are presenting your body, now this is verse 1, when you're presenting your body, it says, I think, as spiritual service. I think that's the way the New King James renders it. Peter, are you reading from the New King James? Or other translations say, or your suitable act of worship. Right? It's the same word, and those are 2 legitimate interpretation or translations of that word. Service to Yahweh is worship to Yahweh. Service to God is worship of God. So when Paul says, on account of the mercies of God, present yourselves as, and you could say, suitable act of worship, or your suitable worship, or in service. It's saying that's what your whole life is to God. It is worship to God. And that's how Christians understand this is what I do in response to what God has done for me on account of his mercy in Jesus Christ. I offer up to God my whole life. Likewise, in Leviticus, when we see service, right, this is exactly the same thing. They were delivered out of the house of Pharaoh to worship God, to serve God. And Leviticus is explaining worship to God, service to God. So to offer up a burnt offering, indeed, it is a soothing aroma to God. God is pleased with this offering that is offered to him. In chapter 2, we see the law of grain offerings, and these are the prescriptions of what God requires if you are going to offer, not an animal, but rather something that you have grown from the land, and to give it to God as a sacrifice. And so it is indeed, these are the requirements for what it is. And then we're able to see, such as verse 9, it is a soothing aroma to Yahweh, right? It is pleasing for Yahweh to receive this sacrifice. Chapter 3, we're told about peace offerings. And this is given the explicit prescriptions of how a peace offering would be offered. And here we are able to see in all of these, who is not making these offerings? Moses. Moses is not the one making the offerings. Moses, you remember, he is Aaron's brother. He is a Levite. But it's not through Moses that it is provided. It is through Aaron and through Aaron's sons. And so whether it is a burnt offering, a grain offering, or a peace offering, it is through Aaron and his sons, through the priesthood, that these offerings are made. And so the requirements are given. And here in the requirements, we're able to see that God is the one who stipulates what is an acceptable offering or sacrifice. Israel, nor Aaron, nor Moses can stipulate to God, God, I would like to offer you this in worship. It is prescribed by God. It has to meet God's requirements. God is the one who establishes the standard. And therefore, all of it is, it must meet God's requirement. It must satisfy God's demands. And if the offering of the peace offering is done this way, verse 5 again says it's a smooth, soothing aroma to Yahweh. It pleases God. Now, all of the details are given there. I'm not getting into all of the details. Chapter 4 goes through the law of sin offerings. And here we see another kind of offering that Yahweh gives to Israel to be offered through Aaron and his sons that is going to deal with sins. And so the prescriptions are given. And look at verse 26. Thus, this is the second sentence in verse 26. Thus the priest shall make atonement for him in regard to his sin, and he will be forgiven. The way Israel is presented these offerings that are given through Aaron and his sons is that when they give them according to God's requirements, then God will remove their sin from them. Now, this is where Christians sometimes have struggled, and I think some bad solutions have been wrestled through. And one is to say, okay, Israel, some have said, were not saved through the blood of Christ, that their sins were not dealt with through the blood of Christ, because it says here that their sins will be forgiven through the sin offering. So we have to reckon with this, right? Because the book of Hebrews makes very clear that in fact the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. So you therefore must have to do what's called theology. You must reconcile these together. And I think that this is the maybe an oversimplification, but for me, this is the best satisfaction of how we reconcile these. As God was providing for Israel in the Mosaic covenant, these offerings, and including the sin offering, including, as we'll see, the offering for the Day of Atonement, and the provision that God commands through the priesthood of these sacrifices so that their sins would be forgiven, they were having to take God at his word. They were having to believe God will respond mercifully, and he will look upon the offering that is given in my place for my sin, and he will remove my sin because of the sacrifice that has been provided according to his word. So I think it was trusting or believing that God would be merciful and gracious on account of the sacrifice. Their faith was in Yahweh to be merciful to them and not count their sins against them, but to count it for the sacrifice. Now, in that sense, I think we are learning, because we will see as we come to the end of the book of Moses, that their satisfaction was not in what was provided in the Mosaic covenant, because the Mosaic covenant was not achieving the ends that God said he would achieve. So that at the end of Deuteronomy, we will find out that Moses in chapter 30 is going to say, you need to circumcise your hearts. In the end of Deuteronomy, we're going to see that there is, either written by Moses or by Ezra or someone, but clearly inspired by the Spirit of God, that there was, in one sense, the ability to say, and there's not been a prophet like Moses again. And the Hebrew may seem to indicate that there is the expectation for a prophet like Moses to come, meaning he hasn't come. So there is pregnant in the book of Moses, this hasn't achieved what God has promised. That though God has made this provision through the tabernacle and the priesthood and the sacrifices, that God can dwell among Israel though they sin and God be holy, yet this is not the sacrifice that is going to change God's people. This is not the final place where God has come down and dwells with his people. It is picturing and providing in the present that which will be completed and perfect when the Messiah comes and he brings the new world and the kingdom of God in full. I think you have to reconcile it in some way to understand it. Therefore, I do think it is right for us as Christians to understand, while these things were real prescriptions for Israel to offer to God and to believe for that year, God has forgiven me of my sin, and you could throw in the transgression for the slander that I committed against Chris. I went and offered the sin offering. I made reconciliation. That you would believe, God has been merciful to me, and he has, in that sense, chosen to give me mercy and to look upon the sacrifice instead of punishing me. And in one sense, you would have that for that calendar year. but you're having faith in the promise of God that he would be merciful to you on the account of the sacrifice. But the fact that it was not completing all of God's promises and did not change the heart of God's people, there was a sense of, but this isn't it. This is the nature of Yahweh. This is the nature of the Mosaic covenant. This is what God has provided, and I trust Yahweh to indeed be gracious and merciful. But he hasn't completed all that he has said. So I think in that sense, we understand them to be real provisions of forgiveness for Israel through the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the sacrifices, and yet types, that which were foreshadows of the ultimate fulfillment that they pointed to, which is Jesus Christ and his death outside of Jerusalem on the cross, and the completed redemptive work that God will bring through his Son. So those are some categories. So I view them to be, in one sense, real in the Mosaic covenant, providing in that sense through faith in God being merciful to them for the sacrifice. That's how he dealt with sin in Israel. And yet I also think that the book of Moses is going to present to us a larger message that this is not fulfilling what God has promised. And so they knew them to, in that sense, be also types. Israel knew them also to be foreshadowing of what God would bring in its fullness in the future through the Messiah. More details develop throughout it. But as we go through more of the offerings in the middle of chapter 5, we see the law of guilt offerings that is prescribed. And again, the result, verse 7, and the priest shall make atonement for him before Yahweh, and he will be forgiven for any one of the things which he may have done to incur guilt. We then see what is the priest's role in the offerings, and that goes into chapter 7. And in chapter 8, we see the consecration of Aaron and his sons. And here, what we're able to see, we haven't given into the details, but in the sacrifice, no matter what it is, an animal, a grain for sin or guilt, or if it is the priest and the clothes and the apparatus that he employs, we see in chapter 8 that it is to be separated from that which is common or profane. And so a consecration has to take place for Aaron and his sons. And so we see that the garments, the anointing oil, the bull of the sin offering, and the 2 rams, the basket of unleavened bread, they are gathered and they assembled all the congregation at the doorway. And you see this other use for the tent of meeting, same place as the tabernacle. And Moses did just as Yahweh commanded, and then the congregation was assembled at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And Moses said to the congregation, this is the thing which Yahweh has commanded to do. And Moses had Aaron and his sons come near and wash them with water. He put the tunic on him and girded him with the sash and clothed him with the robe and put the ephod on him. And he girded him with the skillfully woven band of the ephod, which he tied to him. And then he placed the breastplate on him. And in the breastpiece, he put the Urim and the Thummim. And he also placed the turban on his head, and on the turban and its front, he placed the golden plate and the holy crown, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. And we're not going to read through it, but you're able to see whether it's Aaron and his sons and the clothing and the utensils, all of it was separating them, consecrating them apart from the congregation of Israel and to be devoted to the worship or service of God in the tabernacle. Now, here's what we're able to see. How does God provide for his presence to be among Israel, though they sin, and for Israel, though they sin, to have fellowship with him? Through a representative. The priesthood, Aaron and his sons, they represent the congregation of Israel. And yet they can't be like Israel. They have to be distinct from Israel. They cannot be like the rest of the tribes. They have to be separate from the rest of the tribe. They have to be holy. And so, both in the sacrifices and in the priesthood, there is a separation of that which is devoted in worship to God through the tabernacle and everything else within Israel. There's not a mixing of the sacred and the profane. There is a distinct separation. Now, it seems that Christians have made, I think, a misstep, because we think what Jesus has now done is eradicated a distinction of sacred and profane, or common and sacred. And I don't think this is the case. But we're able to see that this is a reflection of what actually we have in Christ as our high priest and the sacrifice that he has made for us. And this is therefore, as we will see on the back end of the descent in the book of Leviticus, the reason that Leviticus says that everything must be holiness unto the Lord. So we see the apostles and Jesus command that those for whom Jesus died and makes his bride, they are to give themselves wholly to the Lord. That we're able to see, no, we are not profane. We are not, in that sense, to be common. Our lives are to be devoted. It's not, removing categories of sacred and common, sacred and profane. It's able to understand now Jesus is that Holy One who has offered himself in high priestly service as the sacrifice for our sins, that now calls us to live a holy life. That's not removing the distinction of sacred and profane, but you see Yahweh speaking to Moses from the tent of meeting makes this distinction for the priests and the sacrifices, that they are to be separate. And so in chapter 8, we see the consecration of Aaron and his sons. I will say a few things. Therefore, you are able to see, did it please Yahweh to have visible, you even have, we'll call them socioeconomic distinctions between Aaron and then his sons, and then we see it is carried by the tribe of Levites or the Levites. Were they to be distinct and they looked distinct from the rest of Israel? Yes. Was there even in the way in which there was the tabernacle that was constructed, and the very architecture created a series, if you will, of divisions that sort of made very clear. If you came close, you could go but so close, and then your representative, the priesthood, would have to come closer. And this was visually and spatially indicated. Yes, that pleased God. Right? These things are not negative. This pleased God to make the way in which he would dwell with Israel, and Israel could have fellowship with him by dealing with their sin, satisfying his holy demands at the tabernacle through the sacrifices and the priesthood. It pleased God to have these distinctions and to make them visible and tangible. Now, we are not trying to recover the Mosaic covenant. We are not trying to reestablish in any way Aaron and his sons in the Levitical priesthood. But I just think we need to make careful distinctions between, I like things to be casual. I like things to seem sort of like, I feel comfortable. No one felt comfortable when it came to your representative, i.e., the priest, now going into the holy place to offer atonement for your sin. Comfortable would be the exact wrong response to what God has provided in the tabernacle for Israel. we find resolution in what God has provided for us in Jesus. As Israel found resolution, and even we'll see Moses found resolution in what God provided for Israel in the tabernacle. And he did it through the sacrifices, through the priesthood consecrated. And so in chapter 9, we have this sacrifice and the priest now come to consummation, and they offer the sacrifices. They offer the sacrifices according to what Yahweh has prescribed to Moses from the tent of meeting. In one sense, this is the answer to that great question that cries out in Psalm 15, verse 1. Like, who shall ascend to your holy hill? Who shall approach the Lord's dwelling place? And so here we have the priest representing the people going to make the sacrifice according to God's prescription. And so Aaron and his sons, as the elders of Israel are gathered, he is commanded to take for himself a calf, a bull for a sin offering, a ram for a burnt offering, both without blemish, and bring them near before Yahweh. We see instructions, but we're going to jump to verse 8. So Aaron came near to the altar, slaughtered the calf of the sin offering, for which was for himself. It goes through, tells more, verse 12. Then he slaughtered the burnt offering, and Aaron's sons handed the blood to him, and he splashed it on the altar. Then look to verse 15. Then he brought near the people's offering and took the goat of the sin offering, which was for the people, and slaughtered it and offered it for sin like the first. Jump to verse 18. Then he slaughtered the ox and the ram, the sacrifice of peace offerings, which was for the people. And Aaron's sons handed the blood to him, and he splashed it around the altar. Now here's the apex. Verse 22, then Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people and blessed them, and he stepped down after offering the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offering. And then, verse 23, Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. Then they came out and blessed the people, and the glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people. And then fire came out from before Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar. And all the people saw it and shouted and fell on their faces. Consummation of God's provision of sacrifice, priest, ordinances come to Moses and Aaron enter. And then God's presence is made visible to all the people. He receives the worship that they give to him in response to his provision of a sin-atoning substitutionary sacrifice made through an appointed high priest. This is how Leviticus provides how God's presence, tabernacle, and Israel's fellowship with God, the tent of meeting, are indeed God dealing mercifully with Israel. When you look at it maybe in this bigger picture, and there's all kinds of details that I have skipped over, does the God of Israel seem to be different than the God of the church? Does the way in which God allows for Israel to be his people and for him to be their God, does it seem different than the way the God of the church, Jew and Gentile, are able to say, God is our God and we are his people? It's the same. He is a gracious God because he forgives the sins of his people, because he provides a sacrifice that he mercifully judges to be the one who pays the penalty of their sin in their place. Indeed, there's not a difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. There is not a difference in the God of Israel and the God of the church. There's not a different way to God in Israel in the Old Testament and a different way to God in the church and in the New Covenant. Now, they are different covenants. And we are going to see that indeed, though this is God's provision for Israel, for his presence and their fellowship, they will be cursed. And they will be cursed for their sin, which will lead us to conclude the hope, and even Leviticus will teach us, chapter 26, the hope of Israel in the future is not the Mosaic covenant. It is not Moses and as the mediator of this relationship with God. It's going to be the covenant promises that he makes with Abraham. And the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise, we will see at the end of Leviticus, that is the hope of Israel. But we see God as merciful. And thus, in relationship with Israel through the Mosaic covenant, he provides atonement for their sin so that he may dwell with them and they may have fellowship with him. So we'll stop there. I hope to get to 10, but we will see violations occur, and they are tragic. And this will be the place where violations among the priesthood occur. We will also see violations with the people occur, and both result in the tragic divine judgment upon those who approach God in sin. If you have questions, let me know what they are. I'll be honest, I'm having to learn a lot. So it's really fun for me. But the book of Leviticus has got lots of details that I do not have all categorized in my mind.